What up, gamers? I brought it back again. This time I'm not going to comment on what I said. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. Today, we're going to be looking at everyone's favorite land-based empires, the Ottomans and the Russians. So today, we are going to talk about two major land-based empires. We've been talking about oceanic empires, this unit mostly. We'll be looking at the Ottomans in decline and the Russians, to a degree, also in decline, as we will talk about. But the bellwork on the screen right now, between 1830 and 1914, what's going on economically in Latin America? And you should be able to describe kind of that idea of informal imperialism. Awesome, let's get started. Well, today we're going to focus on the Ottoman and the Russian empires. We'll talk a lot about empires that aren't Western empires, but will establish an imperial presence and still be a major force in world politics until the start of the 20th century. So the lesson objective on the screen: explain how various economic factors contributed to the development of the global economy between 1750 and 1900. Well, as I said at the beginning in my rant, never mind. As I said at the beginning, we mostly have been talking about oceanic empires with overseas territories like the British Empire. However, today we're going to pay attention to the Ottomans and the Russians. So let's first take a look at the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Way back in Unit 3, we talked about the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Now we're going to talk about the fall of the Ottoman Empire, unfortunately. It's my opinion the Ottoman Empire is the coolest empire that we have talked about. Well, I guess the Mongols were pretty cool, but I like the Ottomans. Never mind, I won't make that joke. So let's just get a context for what the Ottoman Empire looks like by the 19th century up until the end of the 20th century. Well, the Ottoman Empire is in a state of decline. It reached its height in the 16th century, the 17th century, but it is in a period of free fall at this point in world history. And why is that? Well, there are three big reasons. Let's look at them. Firstly, we have a weakened political structure in the Ottoman Empire. We have very corrupt sultans, and we have not clear rules of succession anymore. There's a lot of debates over who should be the next sultan. So there are a lot of tensions within the royal family between the different Ottoman politicians competing for more influence over the sultan. We also increasingly see a less powerful sultan figure himself. We will see more reliance on the vizier in the Ottoman Empire. So the vizier, typically associated with a Middle Eastern country, they're basically a prime minister for the Ottomans. But increasingly, the vizier is taking a lot more power away from the sultans. This is leading to a very weakened political structure. And on top of that, there are also debates concerning, should we westernize or should we stay traditional? Because increasingly, traditionalism is viewed as anti-empire. Traditionalism is not good for empire, is what more modernizers will say in the Ottoman Empire. Increasingly, we see the inability to make Sharia law or Islamic law work in the 20th and 19th centuries. So we have a weakened political structure because of debates concerning legitimacy and succession. We have increasing reliance on the vizier. And we also got the influence of Sharia law. And Sharia law will be upheld by a more conservative faction in the Ottoman Empire. Not only the Janissaries, as we talked about before, but also the so-called intellectual class in the Ottoman Empire, the ulama. The ulama are Islamic intellectuals. They are normally a conservative force. They are against westernization, which a lot of Ottomans feel is necessary for stability to compete with Europe, essentially. But we also got a weakened economy in the Ottoman Empire. We got an influx of silver. That's still a big problem. That really will destabilize the Ottoman Empire, especially as Europe begins to industrialize in the 1750s. So increasingly, there is a decline in a demand for Turkish or Ottoman goods, because you can just get cheaper goods from industrial countries like the British, especially, not especially. This isn't an Easter pun podcast here. That's not a reference to anything. I made that up. I'm a master at improv. Anyway, we see economic stagnation in the Ottoman Empire, which is leading to economic decline and thus a weakened political state as well. But on top of that, we have less territory for the Ottoman Empire. I'll show a map in a second of that decline. But we are going to see periods of invasions, not only by Russia, but we'll also see independence movements, very much inspired by Slavic nationalism. We will see Greek independence in the 1830s. We will see Serbian independence in the 1860s. And the Serbians and the Greeks are going to break away from this Ottoman Empire. Same thing throughout the Balkans. So throughout much of Southeast Europe, we have feelings of nationalism, which is helping break up a multi-ethnic state like the Ottomans. So this internal division, especially over the issue of self-determination, is leading to a decline of Ottoman territory. The Ottomans are surviving, however, because the Europeans in Western Europe don't want to see the Ottoman Empire go away necessarily. The Ottomans are viewed as a sort of balance in what Europe wants to have, a sort of concert of Europe, to have a balance of power between the different European states. And on top of that, the British especially want the Ottomans to stick around because the British want to sell them cheap manufactured goods. The Ottomans and the British have a very close military and economic alliance. So we are going to see British support for the Ottoman state, especially against Russia. And this is a map to visualize the decline of the Ottoman Empire. We got the height of the Ottomans in the mid-1500s. The mid-1500s for the Ottomans were not mid. But by the 17th century, the 18th century, we are losing territory. This light green part, this is area that is only on paper controlled by the Ottomans. So these are vassal states that are breaking away from the direct rule of the Ottomans. By the 1820s, we will lose Greece. We will lose Montenegro. So we are seeing a steady decline. Egypt, as we'll talk about. Oh, Egypt. Egypt wants to declare independence so badly. And eventually they do. And guess who controls Egypt now on paper, or not on paper, but militarily and economically? It's the British. So by the start of World War I, this is really what the Ottoman Empire will look like. Mostly concerned with the Middle East. No more in Africa and less territory in Europe. And one of the major problems that will be presented to the Ottoman Empire will be invasions, actually, by European powers, especially in Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. So let's backtrack really quick. Let's go back to the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is going to inspire an all-out war in Europe against France. And we call this war the Coalition Wars. Basically, everyone v. France. And one of these military leaders that's taking the fight to the other European powers is Napoleon. Napoleon's going to come up with this weird plan, this crazy plan to disrupt the British economy. And by the late 1700s, the early 1800s, India is becoming the crown jewel of the British Empire. So, in order to prevent maximum efficient trade with India, the French are going to take the fight to Egypt. They are going to invade, under Napoleon, Egypt, which is a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. And really the goal is to cut Great Britain off from India, to prevent Britain from ever dreaming about building a canal in Egypt, the Suez Canal. So the goal of Napoleon in Egypt is to prevent the British from trading with India. However, Napoleon is going to have a unsuccessful eventual end to his campaign in India, in Egypt, I should say. We are going to see that Napoleon does have some early victories against the Mamluks, so the native slave soldiers of Egypt. But eventually a British blockade will force Napoleon to leave. Napoleon is going to quickly and slip away to France. However, he's not going to take his army with him. But Napoleon's invasion is important in Ottoman and African history for three reasons. Well, for one thing, the British are going to have even more of a military presence in Egypt. We need to defend Egypt from the French in order to secure our wonderful potential Suez Canal. On top of that, the Napoleonic invasion is a signal of Ottoman military decline. Clearly, the Ottomans cannot defend against European powers. So there's going to be a need, as we will see, for reform. But on top of that, Napoleon's invasion is introducing a lot of European ideas. It is introducing the Enlightenment to Egypt. It is introducing a lot of economic practices like industrialization and capitalism. And Napoleon is going to leave behind a few military technologies like the cannon and artillery, of muskets especially. So Napoleon's invasion is a symbol of Ottoman weakness. It's also going to lead to more British presence in Egypt, and it's also introducing to Egypt a lot of Western ideas. And look at Napoleon right there. He's just so confident that he'll conquer all of Egypt and stop the British. Napoleon. And Napoleon bringing these Western ideas of economy, of military, but also of weakening the Ottomans, is going to encourage feelings of independence in Egypt. So we are going to see the rise of figures that want to demand Egyptian independence from the Ottomans. Well, after the French leave in 1805, the viceroy of Egypt, or the Khedive of Egypt, a dude by the name of Muhammad Ali, this bearded dude right here, he wants to establish Egyptian independence. He has ambitions to create his own empire, essentially, free from the Ottomans. So Muhammad Ali wants to modernize Egypt. He wants to prevent invasions by not only the Ottomans, but European powers as well. So he wants to modernize and industrialize. How does he do this? Well, he's going to adopt a lot of French government practices, especially centralized taxation. And he's going to start a period of industrialization in Egypt. He is going to import advisors and technicians from Europe to help him build these cotton mills, these textile producing cotton mills. He wants to build shipyards to have a modern navy. He has all of these big ideas. And in order to pay for all of this, he is going to buy Egyptian grain from peasants. and then sell that grain to Europe, sell that grain to the British. However, the British are going to increasingly be involved in Egypt. We are going to see the importation of a lot of British business in Egypt. Egypt is going to be viewed as a sort of secondary colony for the British Empire. We are going to see a lot of British loans in Egypt. And to pay back these loans, the British send a little friendly reminder in the form of a military presence. So Ali is slowly trying to industrialize, but he is failing at this. He is going to fail mainly for three reasons. One, it's because we are going to see European intervention against his attempt for Westernization. We are going to see his failed invasion of places like Syria and Sudan be resisted by European powers. The French stop him in Syria, and the British are going to try to stop his ambitions in Sudan. So increasingly, we are going to see European military presence, which is stalling industrialization. And it's mainly the British who have a dominant presence in Egypt. The British are going to send military troops to encourage the building of a canal and to discourage Egypt becoming anything more than a cotton exporter. So the Egyptians are going to be basically controlled by Britain. And even though Ali is going to place a tariff on British goods in an attempt to resist British economic imperialism, the British don't like this. So they're going to send troops as a sort of warning against these tariffs that Ali is putting in place. I bit my finger with my lanyard. So the British intervention in Egypt is preventing industrialization. But on top of that, industrialization takes money. So the costly nature of industrialization is going to discourage industrialization in Egypt, and thus Egypt will be open to European intervention, most namely by the British. But what does this mean for the Ottoman Empire? It means that you have more European presence in territory typically held by the Ottomans. So Egypt will gradually lose its spot in the Ottoman Empire. But how are the Ottomans going to respond to a decline in their military and economic power? Well, they got to make some reforms. But there are going to be a lot of problems getting these reforms. There are going to be a few attempts at reform, especially in recognition that Europe is stronger than the Ottomans. It used to be the different way. In the 1500s, the Ottomans were the superior empire. But now it's the British, now it's the French, now it's the Germans and the Russians. So the Ottoman government is going to realize we need some changes to stay competitive with Europe. So under Sultan Selim III, we are going to see some attempts to strengthen the Ottoman political system. We are going to see attempts to westernize the Ottoman government, to adopt the so-called the so-called European model for government. We are going to see an attempt to centralize taxation so that all of that money is going to the Ottoman sultans to help strengthen the state. That doesn't work because regional governors are going to not listen to the Ottomans, not listen to the emperor, the sultan. So we are going to see a failure to centralize under Selim. We also see a failure to secularize, to remove the importance of the ulama in Ottoman society. Remember, the ulama, very conservative force, they're against Westernization. But the sultans say we need Westernization in order to stay competitive with Europe. So the attempt to secularize the Ottoman Empire is going to face major backlash by the ulama, the Islamic intellectuals. But there's also an attempt to decrease the importance of the Janissaries, who, as you remember, are the very conservative military faction of the Ottoman Empire. And boy, howdy, do the Janissaries hate this. The Janissaries hate this so much that they will find an excuse to execute Selim III for treason. So he is going to be deposed in 1807. There's going to be briefly another sultan, but he'll die. And we'll see the next sultan and his more successful reforms. But these attempts at reforms do face a conservative backlash, especially on the Arabian Peninsula among local leaders there. So the Arabian Peninsula right now is mostly governed by the family from the House of Saud. They are going to be the governors, essentially, of Ottoman control in the Arabian Peninsula. But under the influence of a dude by the name of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, we are going to see a very conservative movement emerge in the Arabian Peninsula that wants to utilize this traditionalism to resist the Ottomans. And if the Ottomans are secularizing under Selim, this is going to lead to calls for a traditionalist conservative Islamic state. So under the direction of Wahhabism, we are going to see a rebellion against the Ottomans. And these rebels actually take control of Mecca and Medina. They're a serious threat to the Ottomans. They are going to be brutally put down. But the Wahhabi rebellion is a sign, not only of Ottoman decline, of the weakened state, the weakened hold over its territories like the Arabian Peninsula. And it's also going to lead to the rise of the Saudi dynasty. And the Saudis are still around today. They are the controllers, the rulers of an independent Saudi Arabia. But we'll talk about that in the 20th century. But they have their origins with this Wahhabi rebellion. So we have initial reaction against modernization, against reform, mostly by conservative factions like the ulama and the Janissaries. However, there are going to be significant threats to Ottoman stability, which will force greater reforms. So under dudes like Sultan Mahmud II, we are going to see a lot of crises, especially for Ottoman control in Egypt and Southeast Asia. Muhammad Ali is basically acting independent in Egypt, whereas the Greeks have gotten this crazy idea that Greece should be ruled by Greek people. So the Greek independence movement and the separatist movement, you could say, in Egypt is encouraging a need to strengthen Ottoman control over its empire. So under Mahmud, we are going to see several reforms. And one of these reforms is ending that conservative influence, the Janissaries. So with some help from some Western military powers, Mahmud II is going to formally abolish the Janissary Corps. No more will they be a political voice in Ottoman politics. After all, they were holding the Ottomans back. And under Mahmud, we are going to see the beginnings of a period of Westernization and reform referred to as the TANZIMAT reforms. These are a series of reforms throughout the 19th century where we are going to see a secularization of Ottoman government. We will see a Westernization of Ottoman military and political institutions. And we will see the promotion of an efficient military and bureaucracy. So the Tanzimat reforms begin under Mahmud, but they are going to take a long time to initiate. So we are going to see a lot of Western influences. For instance, we will see a constitution and parliament. These are designed to ensure there is maximum tax revenue. They clearly work in Great Britain. Let's try them out here in the Ottoman Empire. There's also going to be the institution of natural rights, of things like of legal equality before the law, religious freedom, the right of privacy, the right to freedom of speech. And we are going to see attempts at more secular government. We'll see that especially in problems related with royal succession. We won't see Sharia law outside the royal family. So Sharia law, the Islamic law, is going to go away as a result of the Tanzimat reforms. This is to discourage the authority of the ulama in the Ottoman Empire. They're viewed as holding the Ottomans back, essentially. And on top of this, the Ottomans are encouraging Western education. They want to modernize not only the economy, but the Ottoman military to stay competitive with Europe. But notice right here, these reforms take a fat minute. I hate myself. These reforms take a long time. So even though these reforms will be made, they are going to take a significant amount of time, and a lot of the sultans don't really want to give up power, as we will see. They think that some changes are necessary, but they're skeptical about giving up a lot of power. So who doesn't like the Tanzimat reforms? Well, European countries like it. Europe likes the Tanzimat reforms because it strengthens the Ottomans. And why do they want that? The Europeans want a strong, or at least a stable, Ottoman Empire to ensure a balance of power in Europe. European powers don't want other Europeans taking Ottoman land away from them. There's that fear of that territorial grab should the Ottoman Empire fall. Religious minorities like the reforms because they get rights, so that's cool. But also Westernized Ottomans, people who already were on board with Westernization. They like the fact that there are reforms that favor Westernization. It's mostly going to be from the emerging Ottoman middle class. They like all things Western. They want a liberal Ottoman Empire. And obviously more conservative people hate hate reform and progress. So the ulama, the conservative Islamic intellectuals, they dislike secularization. Conservatives in general dislike a change from tradition. But another group, or I should say person, who hates these reforms, or at least doesn't want them to go too far, is the Ottoman Sultan. The Ottoman sultans don't want to give up too much power. They're going to say, okay, some reforms are needed, but let's not get crazy. Let's not give up any of my power. We are actually going to see a few cultural changes as a result of the Tanzimat reforms. We are going to see a much more cosmopolitan and Westernized Ottoman Empire. We are going to see, especially in Istanbul, the embrace of European culture. We have a Turkish newspaper. That's crazy. We haven't had that before, really, in the Islamic world, at least on the style of the West. We're going to see the adoption of more Western styles of clothing, or at least less quote-unquote Oriental styles of clothing. We are going to see the adoption of the fez, for example. I have a fez. It's actually at my house, but I don't have it here, obviously. So we are going to see an elimination of beards in favor of mustaches. We are going to see the adoption of fezzes, which are viewed as a kind of compromise between traditionalism and Western headgear. And even for women, we are going to see less veiling. It's still going to be a thing, but we see less forms of modest women clothing. Women still have few legal rights, but they can own property now. Awesome, great for women. Good job, women. However, the Tanzimat reforms are not going to go far enough in some people's minds, especially in the minds of more liberal, westernized Ottomans. The sultans haven't given up power. And if the sultans are corrupt, then that means there is little room for improvement. The Ottomans can just the sultans can cancel any form of reform. And the Tanzimat reforms are opening the doors to challenge the sultan's authority. And boy, oh boy, will the Ottomans be challenged. They are going to have their authority challenged by the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th. Well, let's first look at one of the external factors that will lead to the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Well, we've got the Crimean War to blame, because the Crimean War will have an impact on the status of the Ottoman Empire. It's not going to weaken it per se, which is interesting, but it is going to show that westernization is needed and embolden calls for change. So what's the Crimean War all about? Basically, it's this stupid war all about ownership of this piece of territory, Crimea. Crimea is going to be claimed by both the Ottomans and the Russians. So we are going to see conflict not only between the Russians and the Ottomans, but between the Russians and the French and the British. The British and the French, I mixed them up. The British and the French are going to support the continued existence of the Ottomans to check the power of the Russians. So that's why they support the Ottomans. So the short-term cause of all of this is something kind of stupid. The Ottoman Empire is going to say to the French, okay, you can send an emissary to be the protector of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a church in Jerusalem. Traditionally, it's held by Russians, but the Ottomans said, no, it's the French. So that's kind of a short-term cause, what immediately starts this conflict. But a bigger, more important cause is this idea of Russian expansion upsetting the balance of power in Europe. If the Ottomans went away, then that could lead to one power becoming too important, too powerful. There's also this idea of the Eastern question, and this is something you'll have to keep in the back of your mind. It's the notion of how the Ottomans will be divided up once they finally go away. The writing's on the wall. It's only a matter of time. So Western Europe is considering, how are we going to divide up the former Ottoman Empire so that we maintain a balance of power? That's very much an interest of Britain and France getting involved in this war. And the particulars of the war don't really matter. There's invasions of Slavic territory, quote unquote, like Wallachia, Romania, and Moldova. But it's a very brutal war. It's extremely brutal because it will be one of the first industrial wars in world history. The first time we're using railroads and machine guns, or at least a quasi form of machine guns. We are going to see very brutal instances like the result of the charge of the Light Brigade. Thousands of British young men basically walked to their death. So that's an overview of the Crimean War. Why is it important for us today? Because it's important for both the Russians and the Ottomans. Well, firstly, the Russians think that this is important because its loss in the Crimean War is going to weaken the legitimacy of the Russian czars. The czars are not going to be as influential as they previously were as a result of the Crimean War. And it's going to lead to calls in Russia to westernize and industrialize. But we'll talk about that more in a second. What's it doing to Europe? Well, as I mentioned before, it's the first industrial war. We have the use of artillery. We have the end of cavalry for the most part, and the use of the telegraph. You can instantly get reports of this war in a matter of seconds. And part of this is going to lead to the rise of newspapers being a form of propaganda. You can produce newspapers so cheaply and so quickly, you can sell them to any Joe Schmo for a nickel, basically. So newspaper propaganda, that's one of the new developments in Europe as a result of the Crimean War. We're also seeing the idea of battlefield medicine emerge. So we have ladies like Florence Nightingale, who will be viewed as a champion of battlefield medicine, and also bringing some changes into how women are viewed in military service. But right now we're focusing on the Ottomans. Why is it important to the Ottomans? Well, the Ottomans actually win. So good for them. They prevent Russian expansion into Ottoman territory. And the alliances with the French and the British are going to lead to increased trade with Europe. This is going to fuel development of cities in the Ottoman Empire. And in these cities where we start to see industrialization, we also see the rise of a westernized middle class who come into a lot of contact with Westerners like the British, like the French. And it's this westernized middle class that will lead to calls for change in the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things this middle class wants to challenge is the absolutist rule of the Ottoman sultans. Remember, the sultans didn't really want to give up any power during the Tanzimat reforms. So under Abdul Hamid II, who is the last absolutist sultan of the Ottoman Empire, not the last sultan, but the last absolutist, he is going to make himself very unpopular among Ottoman liberals. He is going to do terrible things like ignoring the constitution, suspending civil liberties. He's persecuting Jews and Christians. He's also persecuting ethnic minorities like the Kurds and the Armenians. But he's also bankrupting the Ottoman Empire, especially in prolonged wars with Russia and the Balkans. So increasingly, there is instability in the Ottoman Empire. It's going to have a huge public relations campaign disaster because all of these factors are going to signal to Western Europe that the Ottomans can't take care of their empire. There's this notion of the Ottomans being the sick man of Europe. And on top of this, there is that question that if the Ottomans fall, then there is going to be a scramble for Ottoman territory by the European powers, this so-called Eastern question. So we are going to see a need for reform, especially heightened by the presence of an Ottoman liberal middle class. So we are going to eventually see the end of the Ottoman Empire, mostly as a result of westernized influence. So in the late 1800s, early 20th century, we are seeing the rise of prominent military officers from the westernized middle class. And they are going to say, we need to modernize this country if we want to keep it afloat. We need to get rid of an outdated institution, the Sultan. So these westernized military nationalists, they are called Young Turks. They want to westernize and modernize the Ottoman Empire. They want to have a constitutional monarchy, to have a liberal government, to promote economic development, and to reclaim nationalist honor. So the Young Turks are going to lead a rebellion, a revolution in the early 1900s. So these nationalists, these reformist nationalists, they are going to stage a rebellion and institute military rule in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan is still around, on paper, but the Sultan doesn't really have any power anymore. And the Ottoman sultans even go away because the Young Turks say, okay, you're trying to attack the newly formed republic we're trying to make, get out of here. However, this is going to open the door for a lot of political instability in the Ottomans. Who is going to replace the Sultan? Is it going to be the civilian government or will it be the military government? The military government tends to win, led by these Young Turks. And they are going to lead Ottoman Empire into a series of ill-fated alliances, which will lead to Ottoman involvement in World War I. But turns out, World War I is the final straw on the camel's back, no pun intended. World War I will disrupt the unity of the Ottoman Empire, open it to European invasion, and thus it will lead to the end of the Ottoman Empire by the 1920s. But the Western response to this is going to be, finally, who gets to take what out of the former Ottoman Empire? And we'll talk about this more after World War I, because it's going to have a lot of consequences that groups in the Middle East still debate about today. So what are some explanations for Ottoman decline? And not only consider the factors I listed at the beginning, but what about that presence of a westernized middle class? How are they contributing to decline? And then what are some attempts to prevent this decline? Are they successful? Let's turn our attention now to Russia, to Mother Russia. What's going on between the early 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century with World War I and the Russian Revolution? Well, first we got to establish some context. Well, Russia, as we all know, is not going to industrialize prior to the end of the 19th century. Russia is mostly agricultural. It still has serfdom, for God's sake. There are few cities that are capable to support industrialization. So much of Russia is deeply behind in terms of Western Europe. Excuse me for a second. I'm sorry, I don't have COVID. We are going to see some attempts at Westernization to stay competitive with Western Europe. We'll see that under Catherine the Great, under Peter the Great. They're going to adopt a lot of Western European customs and culture. And yet, after Catherine the Great, we really won't see any more of this, at least for a while. We do see some industrialization. The British will heavily invest in factories and in entrepreneurs and education. However, local Russian elites mistrust industrialization because that's going to upend the institution of serfdom. We are going to see a reaction against attempts at modernization by the Russian noble elite. But Russia is also important because of its strong and distinct cultural identity. Remember, Russia is mostly Orthodox Christian. They speak Cyrillic languages. And they're very much associated with their Slavic ethnicity. So by the end of the 19th century, we see an intellectual movement to justify Slavic national identity, and we call this Slavophilia. It's very much related to something we call the Pan-Slavic movement. Essentially, there is a call for all Slavs across Eastern Europe to unify under one country, with Russia being the dominant one. So Russia has this feeling of Slavic nationalism. That's very much distinct from Western European ideas of culture. Russia is going to expand, and it's going to expand by the end of the 19th century all the way down into as far as Afghanistan. But by the 1800s, Russia expands from St. Petersburg and the Baltic coast all the way to the Pacific Ocean, right up against Alaska. By the 19th century, we are going to see more advancement in Central Asia, especially coming up against powers like the Chinese and the Persians. We have the invasion of a place known as the Caucasus, which is a predominantly Islamic region in Central Asia, or Orthodox Christian in the case of Armenia. We also have the invasion of Kazakhstan, which I talked about in the last presentation. And all of this is going to lead to some proxy wars in Afghanistan, especially during that great game I talked about. But Russia is going to be invaded at one point by the French during the Napoleonic Wars. In 1812, when the overture is written, well, not when it's written, but when it's about, Napoleon will invade Russia. He'll fail, as we saw, but Russia's invasion by Napoleon is going to introduce a lot of changes, as we will see, especially in this idea of a Russian national identity. The idea of a broad definition of what it means to be a Russian emerges as a result of its victory against Napoleon. And I mentioned that Napoleon's invasion will help lead to modernization, and we'll see that in a second. So we are going to see some attempts to reform the Russian Empire, mostly to stay competitive with places like France and Great Britain. So we are going to see an increased concern for Russian national defense. Clearly, we need to westernize to defend against industrial countries. So under Alexander I, we are going to see some reforms. Alexander is a conservative. He doesn't want the French Revolution to expand into Russia. That's scary to him. But he is going to recognize that we do need to change Russia in order to stay competitive to prevent future invasions. So Alexander is going to initiate a lot of liberal reforms. He will create a bureaucracy in Russia made up of people who have earned their merit. This is going to very much favor the development of a Russian middle class. So among Russian elites, especially this emerging middle class, or this lower nobility as well, we see an increased interest in westernization, in adopting more modern ideas of culture and technology. It's seen as fashionable to be like the other Europeans, to speak French, for example. So there is going to be a growing liberal-minded reform movement in Russia. And all of this is encouraged by Alexander I. There's especially fascination with how Napoleon structured his army. So the invasion by Napoleon is leading to calls to emulate the French by the Russians. There's even going to be some concern by these military elite for the plight of peasants. We need to do something to alleviate the suffering of the serfs. However, Alexander is going to die, unfortunately, and with him, a lot of these liberal changes, these attempts at liberalization. And Alexander's successor, a dude by the name of Nicholas I, is going to ignore calls for change. Especially, this will impact those middle-class Russian military officers, those members of the lower nobility, who are very much saddened by the lack of future reforms under Nicholas. So Nicholas is going to ignore calls for change, which is going to need a lot of encouragement on the side of these reform-minded middle-class dudes to oust Nicholas I in favor of a constitutional monarch. And this rebellion is known as the Decembrist Revolt, made up of nobles and westernized middle-class people who want to establish a constitutional monarchy that will encourage industrialization and capitalism. So the Decembrists really want a constitutional monarchy. They want Alexander's brother to be the king, and this king to be ruled by, you guessed it, a parliament. So Nicholas is going to ignore this Decembrist revolt. He sends a dude in to discuss terms, but the emissary will be killed. So Nicholas is going to unleash a furious campaign against the Decembrists. There's going to be mass executions in response to this Decembrist rebellion. And on top of this, we are going to see a strengthening of Russian traditionalism, of anti-Western ideas. So very much Nicholas is associated with repression, a secret police, and tightening restrictions on serfs. And yet Russia's loss in the Crimean War under Nicholas I is going to lead to calls for change that will be legitimized by the involvement of the Russian Tsar. And this new Tsar is Alexander II. So Alexander II is going to initiate a lot of reforms with the intention of staying competitive to Russia and other European powers. Alexander is going to want to industrialize, but he's going to say that serfdom is a prevention of industrialization. Serfdom doesn't allow for a working class to emerge. So he is going to get rid of serfdom. That's pretty cool in the 1860s, way before the United States got rid of slavery. Alexander is going to initiate a lot of expansion of property rights. And property rights, of course, are very much hand in hand with what liberal middle-class people want. This is with the intent of encouraging an industrial working class and middle-class involvement in industrial capitalism. However, Alexander won't expand political rights, unfortunately. We are going to see some degree of local autonomy in the form of zemstvos. These are basically local councils made up of peasants. But beyond the zemstvos, peasants don't really have any political rights in the Russian Empire. We are going to see some industrialization under Alexander. That's why we have demand for coal fields in the Kazakhstan. We are going to see the building of industrial institutions like the Trans-Siberian Railroad connecting the west part of Russia with China all the way in the east. And we do see an expansion of Russian trade, especially in China. And yet industrialization is only going to encourage economic divisions in Russia. We are going to see a lot of tensions, especially as there is the creation of an industrial working class. No more simply farming for your day-to-day needs. You need to work in a factory to earn a living. We are going to see an expression of this in violence against ethnic minorities, like the pogroms. These are a series of persecutions of Jews in Russia. We also have a lot of peasant rebellions. We are going to see the destabilization of the Russian economy, which is going to fuel even more demands for change. We're going to see that with moderate groups like liberals. Liberals want to demand an expansion of political and thus economic rights. Whereas we also see more radical resistance to the Russians. We'll see that in the form of organizations, of political parties, influenced by things like socialism and anarchism. And these organizations are going to have a bone to pick with Alexander or with the Tsar in general. So anarchists are going to assassinate Alexander II. which is kind of bad, actually. Well, I mean, someone died, but it's bad for those people who want reform because under Alexander's successor, Alexander III, and his successor, Nicholas II, we are going to see a lot of repression under both of these czars against calls for change. We have censorship. We have the forced exiling of political prisoners. So those are some reforms and lack of reforms under various Russian leaders. So I want you to compare and contrast Russia to Western Europe. Why is it the way it is, both of these places? All right. That actually concludes today's lesson. Thank you for sitting through this. I hope you have a pleasant day. I hope you see a turtle and pet it. And yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but I do that often. All right. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.